Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a second. And Kathleen, now that we have this system, it's whenever you feel ready.
All right. Well, I feel ready and delighted to welcome everyone today. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. We're going to learn about the Gulf of Maine Research Institute's new Climate Center and the climate services provided throughout the Gulf of Maine. As the work of the Maine Climate Council has shown, the Gulf of Maine faces a range of climate-related risks, and Maine Won't Wait lays out an ambitious action agenda to begin addressing those risks. David Reidmiller is the director of the new Climate Center at GMRI, and he's with us today to tell us a little bit more about those risks and the response options, as well as how the Climate Center is advancing climate action in the coastal and marine domain throughout the region. Thanks for joining us, Dave. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 8,500 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today's event. We will hear from our speaker and then tackle questions in the Q&A at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send those questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I'll keep track of them and then read them out at the end. You can message Will Sedlak with any technical difficulties. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thanks again for joining us. And Dave, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. Let me get my slides up here. All right, can I get a thumbs up, Kathleen, if you can see my slides? Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining on what is the remnants of Elsa out the window. Kind of relevant to some of the things we may be talking about today, but I'm pleased to have been invited by Will and Kathleen to talk to you all. MCV has been doing some great work, and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute really enjoys being part of a vibrant community of nonprofit organizations throughout the state of Maine and the Gulf of Maine region, working on environmental stewardship issues. And I thought I would start just by kind of doing a little bit of scene setting around kind of what the ocean means for us, not just in the Gulf of Maine, but frankly throughout the country and throughout the world. This is a figure from the National Climate Assessment, which I ran last time, and incidentally was how the Gulf of Maine Research Institute came upon my radar in the first place. Some of our scientists were authors on that report, and it really shows, on the outside, the type of services that are supported through the different aspects of the marine and coastal ecosystem. And it really demonstrates that it's both, there's an economic component for sure. There is a environmental and human health component. And there's also sort of a societal well-being component as well. And all of these things are critically important and certainly things that help us understand why the Gulf of Maine is so important to us here. So a little bit about GMRI before I kind of dig into the weeds of the Climate Center. For those that don't know, we are an 80-person nonprofit located on the waterfront in Portland. Our mission is to pioneer collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. And we really take a locally focused approach by working with fishermen and the entire seafood supply chain to understand some of the issues they're grappling with and make sure that the research that we do is responsive to the needs and challenges that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis and also over the longer term. And we certainly see recognition that our work is applicable and translatable and transferable, not just to other ocean regions around the country, but certainly around the world as well. And we, as I mentioned, take a real collaborative approach to our mission for sure. We have three real kind of foundational commitments, and this has been the case since our founding, about 25 years ago. The first is in sort of the basic fundamental research that underpins everything else that we do. We are first and foremost a fisheries science and management organization. We work closely with partners at the University of Maine, the Darling Marine Science Center there, the Lobster Institute, folks up at Bigelow Lab, working on a lot of algae work. And we really do a lot of work in kind of pelagic fisheries and other types of commercial fisheries and fishery science, as well as more recently aquaculture science as well. We also have a really strong education program that reaches close to 10,000 middle school students throughout the entire state of Maine each year. And we bring them into our interactive Cohen Center that allows students to kind of do some tabletop exercises, play with live lobsters, and to really understand, what the Gulf of Maine is, how the ecosystem may be changing, and what the implications are for their communities and why it's so important to them, whether they live on the coast or further inland. We also have a community team that maintains very strong connections to the entire seafood supply chain, whether that's the vessel level fishermen, the shore side dealers and processors, or the retailers in food service businesses or large grocers. And so that the community team is really instrumental in our work because it helps us not only ensure that our scientific findings can reach the end user, but that our research can be informed by the latest issues that these stakeholders and partners are really grappling with on a day-to-day basis. And in our most recent strategic plan from a couple of years ago, we kind of focused on 5 different strategic initiatives to really kind of thread together a lot of the strengths of the organization and to chart a little bit of a vision for the future. I won't talk about all of these, but I'll just highlight 2 of them. The first is the impact investment piece. We launched a new Gulf of Maine Ventures initiative that is really seeking to kind of help entrepreneurs and innovators in the blue economy space get off the ground, get them sort of the, not just the investment, but also the kind of technical guidance that they may need to succeed in the, as a new business. And then there is the adaptive communities piece. And this is really where the Climate Center comes into play. There was a recognition throughout the development of our last strategic plan that more and more of the work of the organization had a climate-related angle to it. And one of the things we really wanted to do was to not only integrate that climate-related work across the different departments and programs of the organization, but to elevate its visibility, to make sure that we could really, continue to serve our stakeholders and partners in the most kind of contemporary way possible, while also kind of charting out new territory and thinking about how can we best serve some of those emerging climate-related risks and opportunities that are coming for our way. So if we think about the ocean as a climate savior, I think there are 2 real big kind of climate services, so to speak, that the ocean provides to humanity. The first is demonstrated through this graph, and there's only a couple of technical graphs in this talk, so I won't get in too much weeds. But really what this is showing is from basically the 1970s into the current era, how much energy is stored in the Earth's system, right? And so you can see this kind of magenta purple color here that you can barely make out is how much heat is in the atmosphere, right? And what's interesting, right, is that when we think about climate change or global warming, you think about the Earth's atmosphere heating up. And if we've only seen this much excess heat in the Earth system manifested in the atmosphere, you can kind of compare that to what's going on in the ocean, both the upper ocean, this light blue, and the deep ocean, this dark blue. And the point of showing this is just how much heat is being absorbed by the ocean right now, especially relative to the atmosphere. And you know this in your day-to-day lives by thinking about how long it takes up to boil a pot of water versus heating a little piece of air, for example. And so the point here is that the ocean is a real heat sink for us. And so it's absorbing a lot of that heat that would otherwise stay in the atmosphere, but there are obviously real consequences to that. The other big climate service that the ocean provides is by serving as a carbon sink, right? And so the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide largely through kind of the biological processes, the phytoplankton that absorb carbon dioxide. It certainly does emit some carbon dioxide as well, but on balance, it is a net sink. But the problem when the ocean absorbs more carbon dioxide than it has historically done so in an equilibrium state is that it can become acidified. And that's exactly what we're seeing, right? Because you put more CO2 into the ocean water, you create more carbonate ions, which allows for a lowering of the pH and has a number of ecological consequences as a result. So two really large ecosystem services being provided by the ocean in a climate context, but obviously have negative impacts as well if we get it out of balance. And if we think about the Gulf of Maine and the climate risks that we face here, they're manyfold, right? GMRI has kind of put us on the map in a lot of ways, this region, by highlighting that the Gulf of Maine had been warming faster than 99% of the world's ocean. So we were seeing an extraordinarily rapid rate of warming here, even if the absolute rate of, or the absolute level of warming may not be as great as, say, somewhere in the Arctic, but oftentimes it's that rate of change that can be as important, if not more important, than the absolute value of that change. We talked about acidification. I won't get into too much on stratification and deoxygenation, but those two aspects are certainly quite important from an ecological standpoint. You oftentimes think of these more in large deltaic regions like the Mississippi Delta in the Gulf of Mexico. Sea level rise, certainly we are seeing more and more impacts from sea level rise, in part driven by how large our tidal range here is in the Gulf of Maine. And that's, you can see, I think this is a picture of Union Wharf here in Portland. Or maybe not Union Wharf, one of the other wharfs around there. One of the other important pieces that's happening too is that as the Gulf of Maine warms, as the ecological conditions kind of change, we are getting new species moving in and older species moving out of the region. And that has real implications both on our fisheries, on our economies, but also on the vitality and health of our ecosystems, right? And you can see a picture here of the European green crab, which, while not entirely climate driven, there is believed to be a climate signal to it. And they obviously can wreak havoc on the shellfish industry in particular. And that goes down to kind of some of the other novel species interactions, these stronger storms, no surprise. It's both the stronger coastal storms that leads to more inundation, more coastal flooding, but also we are seeing throughout the Northeast more rainfall coming down in heavier precipitation events. And so what that means is that, for example, you tend to have more inland flooding, more riverine flooding, lots of nutrient runoff, and the greater risk for harmful algal blooms, both in lakes and near shore environments. So with that context, we set out to really define a vision for GMRI's Climate Center. And it all starts by understanding that climate change poses an existential threat to coastal communities as we know them. But we also recognize that it doesn't have to, right? We can actually leverage climate action from the local to the global level to empower coastal communities to thrive in a warmer world. And the way we're going to do that through our Climate Center is by leveraging some of our current capabilities in 4 core areas. The first being fisheries science and management. I mentioned that off the top. Seafood supply chain innovation. We have a very strong program that engages, like I said, folks from the vessel level fishermen through the food service industry, through responsible aquaculture development, and coastal community resilience. We have existing staff, existing programs, and a slew of ongoing projects that really advance these aims. And the other thing that I've done in the first kind of year or so that I've been on board here is to identify some additional areas of opportunity that, in talking to fellow nonprofit organizations, academics, businesses, municipal leaders, in trying to understand both what are the issues that they're grappling with, but also what are other organizations already doing in the region? So how can we, as a new climate player on the scene, really add value to the regional landscape? Because there's already a ton of really great work going on. And there were 3 big areas that I kind of highlighted. The first is in the space of climate policy, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. The state's climate action plan obviously gives us a nice framework upon which to engage. The second is in the domain of climate mitigation. So this is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that can be traditional emissions mitigation, like the development of offshore wind technology, and sort of decarbonizing or electrifying our vessel fleets. It can be electrifying our working waterfronts, finding opportunities in that space. But it could also be kind of some more novel, innovative technologies or approaches like carbon dioxide removal through the ocean, whether that is in the form of kelp farming or other types of carbon removal approaches, like the enhancement or restoration of blue carbon sinks, such as kind of eelgrass beds or salt marshes and so on. And the third big new area of expertise that we're going to build out is in the domain of climate finance. And this is a really important one because it really helps take plans and ideas into on-the-ground action. We have over 100 or so coastal communities throughout Maine, the vast majority of which don't have, certainly not sustainability directors. Many of them don't have, planning positions at all. And so how can we help those municipalities identify the resources they need to, say, raise certain roads, widen various culverts, and to protect critical infrastructure and thoroughfares in their communities? But also, how can we sort of think about designing liability regimes to insulate the risk of fishermen around offshore wind farms? How can we help small-scale aquaculturists diversify the risks they face from climate change? And a variety of other innovative financial tools as well that we're hoping to really explore. So if that's what we're hoping to do, we can't accomplish any of it without sustained engagement with our important stakeholder collaborations. And as I said, that ranges from the vessel level fishermen and the small scale aquaculture farmer, through marine businesses, up through our elected officials at the local, state, and even national level. And with that in mind, I think it's helpful to kind of put our sort of regional risks into kind of a national context here. And so what I'm showing here are our US greenhouse gas emissions mitigation targets. And so the black line, there's a lot here, but I'll walk you through it a bit. The black line basically shows the historical trend in greenhouse gas emissions over time. This goes back to 1990. The green line here is basically the amount that is removed every year from more or less forests. So it's basically the natural land carbon sink, if you will. This red circle is sort of the reference year against which the targets we put forward into the international domain under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the sort of reference year. So that's 2005. Generally, that was more or less the peak in US emissions. And what you see on the right-hand side are a number of different scenarios that can play out. And so these dotted lines represent the projected emissions going forward through 2030 before the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And this blue kind of region demonstrates what we expect to happen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So we saw a significant drop in emissions last year because, for example, a lot of people stopped driving as much. And so our transportation emissions across the nation really dropped significantly. Of course, as we're seeing, those emissions have rebounded, right? And that was to be expected. We saw the same thing happen in the wake of the big recession back in 2008, 2009. And then these kind of little barbell figures here, this black one here, this green one here, and this purple one here, those represent the formal targets that the US has put forward in the context of the international climate regime. So this was our Copenhagen commitment, this was our Paris commitment, and this is the one that we announced just over Earth Day this year, and will be formally enshrined in the Glasgow Summit later this year. And the reason I highlight this is to demonstrate that, we actually more or less, depending on who you talk to, succeeded in reaching our Copenhagen target in 2020. And the target that we put out in Paris for 2025 was a reduction of 26 to 28% below these 2005 levels. And we're close to getting there based on what we've already accomplished, but obviously we have more work to do. And what's truly extraordinary is that the target put out earlier this year was for 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And so the important thing to think about here is the slope of this line. And the slope of this line increases over time. And what that means is that more and more ambition is needed, more and more aggressive policies and action and deployment of renewables and energy efficiency and so on and so forth is needed if we are to reach these targets. And of course, we do have a sort of soft target, if you will, of reaching a net zero economy by 2050. And so you can just see how difficult some of these goals are going to be to meet, which basically speaks to, and this is the whole point of this slide, the magnitude of the challenge before us. But that's just the emissions side of the equation. We need to think about adaptation as well. This is an article from a couple months ago in the New York Times, really talking about how we are not yet prepared as a nation to really think about adaptation, certainly in the context of post-disaster recovery, but also more proactively. And I think that's something we certainly need to be doing a better job on. Unfortunately, here in the state of Maine, when Governor Mills came on board, she established the Maine Climate Council. In law in 2019, they released the Maine Won't Wait, our ambitious 4-year climate action plan that came out in December. I suspect I know there have been talks about this on MCV's Lunch and Learns before, so I won't spend too much time focusing on this specifically, other than to highlight that there are a number of strategies focused on both reducing greenhouse gas emissions and building out our adaptation to climate change and resilience into our system so we can really deal with the impacts of climate change that are going to happen regardless of how much mitigation occurs. And so if we think about what that means for the Gulf of Maine Research Institute and our Climate Center, as I mentioned, we see the state's climate action plan as a useful framework against which to sort of frame our climate work. And so we pulled together with the help of Hillary Swimmer, who was a really helpful Colby College jam plan intern with us earlier this year, kind of map over 90 projects that we have done in the recent past and are currently ongoing against the strategies and objectives of Maine Won't Wait. And they really touch on almost all of the strategies, but really focus on three of them in particular. And I'm going to spend just a couple minutes kind of going through those in particular. And I'll just highlight the link below if you're interested in finding more about that. I can send it to you after the meeting as well. And the first is what they're calling Strategy D, where we're growing Maine's clean energy economy and protecting our natural resource industries. We have a number of projects that are advancing this strategy. Among them are looking at different allocation strategies for fisheries affected by climate change, which aims to develop guidance and adaptive strategies for fishery managers grappling with climate change-induced allocation challenges. We have another example is the climate adaptation strategies for Northeast U.S. fishing communities, which really works directly with communities to understand their needs and interests in order to develop more community-specific information about expected future species changes, economic impacts, and different adaptation options for those fisheries. I won't go through all of these, but you can, again, poke around on our website and that report in particular, which has hyperlinks to each of the project pages. Another one is Strategy E, protecting Maine's environment and working lands and waters. We have a number of different activities across different departments and organization, different parts of the organization, including our ocean data products team that has launched a climate fisheries dashboard, which is a web-based application for fishery stakeholders in the Northeast to sort of support kind of the integration of complex climate relevant data into their sort of day-to-day decision-making as it relates to kind of past and projected changes in the marine environment. We have a pretty expansive citizen science program. If any of you are in the Portland or South Portland region, you may have seen the recent deployment from the Maine Silver Jackets of different signs across on our waterfront, highlighting what the implications are from the from sea level rise relative to the large winter storm of 1978. And so we certainly have a lot of work going on in terms of coastal flooding and the citizen science space. There's Lisa Kerr on our staff, one of our leading senior scientists, has been doing quite a bit to really think about how we can sort of evolve the fisheries management in the region to account for sort of the dynamic nature of the Gulf of Maine ecosystem as climate change unfolds. And so that's part of the Northeast Climate Integrated Modeling piece. And I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight this Gulf of Maine temperature trends work. You know, as I mentioned earlier on, Andy Pershing really put us on the map, put the region on the map globally in a big way with our sea surface temperature anomaly work, and Adam Kemberling has continued that. And you can see just in this image here, this basically is just a time series, I won't get into the details of it, of the prevalence of marine heat waves in the Gulf of Maine. And you can see the top of the map, top of the plot here is more recent years, and you can just see the predominance of marine heat waves in our environment more recently. And the third main strategy that I'll just highlight is the engagement with the Maine people and communities about climate impacts and program opportunities. We have a range of projects that do this, that take advantage of the Interactive Cohen Center that I mentioned here at GMRI, but also through our community engagement. I think Gail Bonus might be on the call here. She is our Municipal Climate Action Program Manager, and she has been really successful in engaging communities to understand, to advance an understanding of what their vulnerabilities may be as a result of sea level rise, and to understand what the consequences of different adaptation pathways may be as they pursue resilience to those coastal impacts. So if we think about, the framework that I laid out and where we are now, I think one of the really important things to kind of contextualize the work of the Climate Center is to think about it in terms of the delivery of climate services to coastal and marine stakeholders. And what that means is that we want to be in the business of developing, fundamental world-class science in-house and translating that into on-the-ground action. And we want all of that to be informed by sustained engagement with a variety of stakeholders. And that starts with a really robust team of climate scientists. And we have some on staff already, and we're working on building out additional capacities as well. Thinking about folks that can do some high resolution, highly localized projections of sea level rise to really understand a much more nuanced picture of what inundation may look like across the coast. Bringing in a coastal ecologist that can really work with folks across the region to understand not just how marsh migration may occur, what the impacts may be to sensitive ecosystems and threatened species, but also think about how we may sort of restore some of those living shorelines and so on. We're also going to build out a climate engagement team that is going to help take that, not just the science that we do, but the broader science throughout the community into the hands of both municipalities through the Municipal Climate Action Program that I mentioned, as well as a corporate climate action program that we're getting ready to launch and to complement sort of that public sector component with a private sector piece that will be able to kind of leverage the momentum that exists in the business community right now to really engage on climate action, both in terms of building resilience throughout their supply chain, but also to think about how they might start being real sectoral leaders when it comes to decarbonizing and reducing the carbon footprints of their products, of their facilities, of their operations. And then finally, as I said earlier, it's really important that we don't just, produce papers and and reports, but really translate that into on-the-ground action. And we're going to do that through a solutions team that is going to be made up of a climate finance specialist, a coastal planner, or kind of a civil or environmental engineer, a climate risk modeler that will help us understand kind of the climate-related financial risk exposure to either institutional investors or asset holders or capital markets or other things, and to really understand how kind of ocean perils, if you will, whether it's those marine heat waves or stronger storms may impact a lot of different things we care about, as well as the potential credit ratings for municipalities, because it could be more and more difficult to secure bonds if they are deemed to be have a large risk exposure. So I'm going to go quickly through what we've been doing in terms of the Municipal Climate Action Program, because that's really where we are right now in terms of our capabilities. And it's been a program that started from really focused on sea level rise and engaging coastal communities to better understand the local impacts of sea level rise. It was developed with the support of Greater Portland sustainability staff, planning professionals, and state sea level experts. And we facilitated community dialogues around sea level science, projected sea level rise, examining interactive maps and discussing resilience strategies with over 2,000 individuals and 30 communities throughout the state from York up to MDI. More recently, we got a new grant from NOAA's Environmental Literacy Program with where we're able to partner with some amazing organizations to develop regional rural resilience trainings for coastal communities to provide them with the knowledge, skills, relationships, and capacity to plan for climate impacts such as sea level rise, following the recommendations of the Maine Climate Council that I highlighted earlier. These trainings are going to engage current and emerging leaders within the communities with the goal of bringing diverse voices to the table to support a process, an inclusive process for community-based and data-driven decision-making. And as we move forward, we're looking at trying to understand how comprehensive community planning ought to incorporate new modes of thinking and data sets that often raise more questions than bring answers. And the planning process needs to be inclusive and equitable. as this work moves forward, through leveraging existing projects, through growing the capacity of our climate center, and by deepening existing and new partnerships, we're going to provide a suite of complementary programs and resources to communities to support them in developing and implementing climate action plans. And I know the graphic here is relatively small, but what it's showing is basically the resilience planning capacity in civil divisions throughout the state. And so the cooler colors show where there is a larger amount of in-house planning staff, and the warmer colors show where there is basically no in-house planning staff. And so you can just see the extraordinary need for this capability and capacity throughout the state, and especially as you get further down east. And in working with organizations like the Island Institute, we've been really successful in helping to build that capacity, and in some cases be that capacity. And so I'm just going to end with what we envision thriving coastal communities to look like. I mentioned in the beginning that our vision is to really take the existential threat that climate change poses to coastal communities and making sure that we can leverage climate action from the local to the global level to ensure that coastal communities can thrive in a warmer world. And those coastal communities that are really vibrant in the decades ahead will hopefully be based on sustainable fisheries, have resilient infrastructure and healthy coastal zones, diversified economies that allow them to sort of weather the storm, so to speak, as climate impacts become more and more apparent and frequent and bigger in magnitude. And of course, all of this really needs to be community-driven, community-specific, site-specific. And the way we're going to be able to do that is by building out a climate literate society that recognizes how valuable it is to promulgate equity and justice throughout the different adaptation and mitigation pathways we're going to pursue. So with that, I'll put up my contact information. I would encourage you all to visit our website, and I'll turn it over to Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate you walking through everything that the Climate Center is undertaking and all of those incredible resources. So everybody knows, we will send out this link, gmri.org/climate, in the follow-up email this afternoon. It is well worth exploring the Climate Center, signing up for the mailing list, and consider supporting these efforts, because it really is just fabulous work. There are a bunch of questions about that work, so why don't we get right into them? First off, Dave, you mentioned novel species interaction. What is that? Can you give us an example?
Sure. So, we are seeing species move in and out of the Gulf of Maine. A good example is, black sea bass. This is a species that historically hasn't been particularly prevalent here. It's becoming increasingly prevalent, and that obviously has implications for young crustaceans and shellfish, because they do feed on them. But it also represents a new opportunity, right? Because it is, a marketable fish that we could, in theory, fish and kind of create a new market. There are challenges associated with that, though, because, it's not clear really, well, we don't really have the quota and the permits in place to really allow us to fish that population quite yet. And so that's part of the work that we're exploring, hopefully to do with support from Maine Sea Grant going forward. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned here, right? Because some of these things have already been experienced, say, in communities like Point Judith down in Rhode Island, and New Bedford, and some of these other communities where there used to be quite a significant lobster fishery, for example, but there no longer is in Connecticut. And so thinking about, okay, as squid become more prevalent, can we create more of a squid market? And similarly, let's be paying attention to what's also happening on the other side, right? The Canadians and Newfoundland and Nova Scotians are seeing and will continue to see more and more American lobsters. And so how can we share some of our best practices in maintaining a sustainable lobster fishery to the Canadians.
That's super interesting. Thank you. To clarify a little bit about the work that GMRI is doing, I don't know why I stumbled over that yesterday every time I said it too. But are you all doing direct measurements of the cold water currents and changes these flows are having on the ecosystem, or are you using data collected from others?
It's a mix for sure. We don't, and it depends. Graham Sherwood, for example, on our staff here, one of our scientists, has been doing for years now a number of acoustic surveys for herring and other species to see their sort of prevalent abundance and distribution. We also we do, some other kind of in situ work, so to speak, some actual field gathering to support eDNA work, environmental DNA work, to sort of detect species that we may not actually physically see, but can detect through different traces of them in the water. And when it comes to sort of the sea surface temperatures and other things, a lot of that is derived from satellite platforms, other remote sensing instrumentation. And there's a lot of simulation work involved, right? A lot of model development that takes, very sophisticated, frankly, computational programming to basically try to develop equations that define the way Earth systems act, right? And to really sort of, there's just a great sort of marriage of sorts between sort of the in situ fieldwork observational data informing the development and refinement of those models over time. And that's not just in the fisheries management space. We do that in the broader climate space as well.
It's just fascinating when we talk about listening to the scientists. You're the guys we're talking about. So thank you very much for both collecting and collating that data in a way that we can access it and really make good decisions. There's always this, in this work of climate action, there's always a little bit of not attention, but there's the mitigation on the one side, and then there's the adaptation. And as much as we want to believe that if we mitigate enough, we won't have to adapt, I don't think that's quite true. I think we've passed that point. But let me ask you a question about mitigation first. You mentioned transportation emissions, and so a lot of folks are thinking about electric vehicles and how we can help support the transition to electric vehicles to reduce transportation emissions. Curious what you think about that and any tips you have. But then also, is there any progress on reducing the carbon footprint of boats and ships and water-based transportation?
Sure. Yeah, no, a couple of things I'll say about that. So the US, is fairly anomalous globally in terms of where our emissions come from. Our emissions are dominated now by transportation, not power generation, which is really sort of unusual. And that is largely because of light duty and passenger vehicles, right? And so there's a real opportunity to be had to lower our emissions by electrifying our passenger vehicle fleet, right? Which is why you see, as part of the infrastructure conversation at the federal level, such a push by those quote unquote climate hawks in Congress to not only incentivize the sort of production and consumption of electric vehicles, but also the ensuring that we have the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure throughout the country to ensure that to sort of reduce the chicken and egg problem, so to speak. And that's a big reality for sure. So I do think we're poised to make great strides. I think because when the federal government sends a signal, industry follows. They want that certainty, right? And frankly, you've seen that with some of the major automakers. GM, is a great case. They did a real kind of 180 between towards the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration in terms of what their EV commitments were going to be. And it's not just GM, you've seen it across the board. They're all making really, really big commitments, right? You saw Ford release their F-150 Lightning, right? That's a huge actual, I mean, a very smart strategic move on their part, I would argue, to really penetrate that market. It is the best-selling, car in the country. So to demonstrate that that kind of technology is reliable, is enjoyable, is affordable, all of those things is super important. When it comes to transportation emissions from marine vessels, it's small, but it's not insignificant, right? Especially on a global scale. When you think about a lot of the cargo ships in particular have, they're I think maybe, it's 1 or 2% of global emissions are from, international shipping in particular, and bunker, well, more if you include all bunker fuels. And so the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, certainly has taken this on, and they've worked to, promulgate sort of guidance and policies that would, reduce those emissions over time. But this is a challenging industry for sure, because there's not a whole lot of cost-effective alternatives right now for that sort of thing. And so there are conversations about how can you optimize speed, how can you design a ship to reduce its drag and to make it more fuel efficient, since there's not a really good alternative fuel right now. When it comes to sort of the more parochial, so to speak, fishing industry, I think it's you can think about it in a couple of different tiers, right? You have sort of the trawlers and the lobster boats, which can be particularly challenging to sort of, right now at least, find an alternative that is going to perform as well and frankly as economically as the current suite of largely diesel-powered boats. But there's real opportunities to sort of demonstrate these alternative technologies either in aquaculture farms and some of the boats there, and or even in the recreational boating world, right? And if you can demonstrate either the capabilities of, an electric engine, a battery, or even hydrogen fuel, there's been some good work there. I know the Maine Climate Table, for example, is working with Richard Nelson, a retired lobsterman, in exploring what some of these alternative fuels might be feasible. So there's definitely work going on in the area. I think it's, but there's some big technological and economic hurdles that we need to overcome. Yeah. Thank
you. Thanks for that. So I set this up by saying I'd ask you an emissions question or an adaptation, a mitigation question, and then an adaptation question. So here it comes. Even if we meet these goals, we get our emissions way down, we electrify everything that we can and push the technology forward so that we can electrify more and more. We're not undoing changes that are already sort of baked in, right? We're on a trajectory for changes, particularly in the marine environment. Where does GMRI come in on helping in education about managed retreat for coastal communities, things like that? What are you thinking about on some of those really tough questions?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're unavoidable, and they're going to become increasingly so. And I think one of the most important things to consider, is making sure that the processes that are involved in making those decisions are inclusive and transparent from the start. I think there's a whole body of academic research now looking at sort of how to do things like management retreat in an equitable way. Folks like A.R. Siders at the University of Delaware is a leading expert, as is Catherine Mock at the University of Miami. There's a number of really, really smart folks thinking about how to do this. And unfortunately, we're already having to do it in a number of places. The Isle de Jean Charles down in the Louisiana Delta, indigenous communities like Newtok up in Alaska are having to do this. And it's really challenging. Not only, I mean, obviously it's costly, but the emotional connection to their land and sense of place is a real difficult thing to overcome. And I don't think we do anybody any any help by sort of discounting that or not really putting that fore of mind ahead of, frankly, the economic costs, because that's very real. We are certainly, committed as an organization and through our Municipal Climate Action Program in doing a lot of that community level engagement. As I mentioned, Gail, our Municipal Climate Action Program Manager, has been doing just that, and she's increasingly doing it with, as you saw that one slide, with partners like the Island Institute and the Greater Portland Council of Governments and several other organizations to engage, in particular, rural coastal communities that don't have that capacity to really understand what their options are and what the consequences of some of those options are, and really doing that in a way that engages a broad cross section of community members in a way that they feel as though their voices are heard and that their considerations are being integrated into whatever processes are involved.
Yeah, it's a tough process that we have ahead, and I'm so grateful for the way that you're working with community-centered groups and really making sure that that process reflects the community at hand, which means it's going to look different throughout the state and throughout the country and the world, right? One of our questions today comes from someone who lives on an island where there's not a coordinator, there's not that sort of planning staff. And I'm just going to read it directly. We've had a major influx of well-off people from urban areas to our rural island. This makes me wonder, how do we communicate the sense of place, cultural identity, and need for social equity to people who love this place, but come from a different world?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a real challenge. That's for sure. I think one of the things that I learned firsthand in developing the National Climate Assessment, which was really intended to sort of basically speak to the entire country about climate change, was that it's an exceedingly difficult challenge, right? And part of the reason is because, the value systems are different in every community you go in, right? And so it's really important to sort of to listen to each other and to understand, what is it that they care about, both the people that have been living there for generations, but also the people that have recently moved there. As this person acknowledges, these new residents love this place too, right? And so I think it's trying to cultivate a shared system of understanding and patience, and not just sort of waiting for your chance to speak, but really hearing them and listening to them and understanding what it is that they care about. And hopefully that will, kind of create a shared sense of understanding and forge sort of a shared value system going forward. I also want to say, I think it's important that we not be afraid to evolve our, coastal communities as well, right? I mean, there's obviously so much that we ought to cherish, about sort of the shared heritage, but we also have a real opportunity to sort of, look forward and to really create these sort of thriving coastal communities of the future that can really be, kind of a gold star example of what sort of climate resilience can look like, not only across the Northeast or Northern New England, but the country and the world, frankly.
Thank you for that reminder that this isn't just about challenge, it is also about opportunity, and that we have a really affirmative chance to make positive changes and make our communities even stronger. So everyone wants to line up to work with GMRI on the Municipal Action Program. How many communities do you think you'll be working with? And will it be all of us who are on the call today?
Great. Well, I would encourage you all to reach out to either myself or to Gail Bonus, as I mentioned earlier, who's really leading that effort. We've been fortunate to again just partner with some extraordinary people and extraordinary organizations and we've had success in securing foundation funding and federal funding to expand the work that we've done with Portland and South Portland. communities that have a fair bit of capacity to deal with these issues to really get out into these rural coastal communities. And so we've got, I think that project is over the next couple of years, we'll reach out to 5 different regions that will be a handful of communities in each region. And we're still, in the process of identifying those communities. And frankly, we're relatively well positioned right now between sort of the supplemental budget, the kind of surplus at the state level that we have, as well as the incoming COVID relief funds. There's there are likely to be resources available to communities to explore this type of work. And I think, again, the state's climate action plan really provides all of us a framework around which to kind of assess not only vulnerabilities, but opportunities for action and where some of the low-hanging fruit might be. So yeah, go to gmri.org/climate, follow our project pages, and yeah, we'll be happy to keep you guys updated for sure.
Great, thank you. I think everybody's going to be looking for that follow-up email with a little more urgency than usual today. You hinted at this a little bit, but I think for our last, we've got time for one more question. And we've talked a lot about community level work and state level work. How does that connect to what's happening at the federal level, and what does that prospect look like?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I came to Maine, I'm one of these folks from away, right? I moved here in August, frankly, realizing, almost a decade-long dream of moving to Maine that I thought was going to have to wait till retirement. And part of the motivation for that was because, I saw, frankly, the sort of opportunity, the enthusiasm, the sort of capability and motivation of the region and the state in particular to really move forward on climate action. And so we're fortunate right now to have a governor, a state legislature, and municipalities lining up with behind climate action. And we have an opportunity at the federal level as well. So again, with the infrastructure bill where it is, that's a real chance. But I think it's also important to recognize that we need not pin all of our hopes on the legislative branch of government, right? There's an enormous amount that the executive branch can and will do at the federal level. They already have done a lot in terms of, undoing kind of some methane rules that will really go after methane aggressively. They've rejoined the Paris Agreement, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, addressing sort of fluorinated gases, which are super potent greenhouse gases used in cooling and other things. CAFE standards, fuel economy standards. We talked about the need for reducing transportation emissions. So there's a lot going on at the federal level. But again, I think it's also important to know that it's not, while state government is important, while the federal government is important, it's also not just the public sector that has both the opportunity and the responsibility to act, right? And which is also why we're really, focusing on building out that corporate climate action program, because the private sector has both a responsibility and an opportunity to sort of act as well. And, through, coalitions like We Mean Business at the national level, through the Business Council on Sustainable Energy, series, the group out of Boston that looks at sort of private sector work in the climate space. There's a lot of action going on and a lot of, I think, momentum in the business community. You could argue that some of it is, TBD as to whether they actually deliver, but at the same time, they're sending a signal, and that is really important, right? Because you're seeing pressure put on boardrooms, you're seeing pressure put on institutional investors, about how their climate-related financial exposure is being accounted for. So it does translate, to get back to your question, from the local level to the federal level. And part of my joy in this position now is that I can take that sort of decade of federal experience in DC and sort of apply it at a local level and, retain that network of folks, in the federal government to really demonstrate to the nation that, hey, Maine may only be, less than 0.5% of the nation's emissions, but you know what? We've taken a really inclusive, transparent, ambitious approach to climate action, and we hope others can learn from our example.
Thank you, Dave. We're definitely in a try everything mode right now when it comes to climate action, and I'm just so grateful for all the experience that you bring. Your arrival in the state is definitely a win for all of us, so thank you. And just thanks to everybody for joining today. As always, we had many more fabulous questions than we had time to talk about today, but to look this afternoon for the follow-up email with the GMRI contact information so you can reach out to Dave if you have further questions. Speaking of trying everything, I hope you'll join us next Friday to learn about some of the legal battles for climate accountability. So in the last few years, 5 states, 20 municipalities, the District of Columbia have been turning to the courts to make fossil fuel companies accountable for their role in the climate crisis. So we will have Alyssa Joel, who's the legal director for the Center for Climate Integrity, and Anthony Maffa, who is an environmental attorney and a professor at the University of Maine Law School, who are going to share with us a little bit about those climate accountability lawsuits, the arguments they make, and the case for climate accountability here in Maine. Hope to see you then. In the meantime, enjoy the, whatever we end up with this for this weekend. Thanks so much for joining.